Well, hello again. Thanks for having me back into your home again. This has been a good time for me. I hope it's been good for you too. We'll try to tell one today, and not that I get a lot of requests, but in counting requests over several years, this has been my most requested story. This is one that happened in the area where I was born, but many years before I was born. Sometime it happened. The story takes place from about the time of the Civil War on up to 1888 was when the story closes. There was a man by the name of Rufus Colquitt. He was my great-great-grandfather, my grandfather's grandfather. He had married and had two children and one on the way when the Civil War between the states, came along. And since he owned horses, he volunteered. If you owned a horse and you volunteered, you could be in the cavalry. If you didn't own a horse, you had to be in the infantry. That was pretty much the way the Confederate Army worked. And Rufus joined as he had his own horse. He was a cavalryman. Now they didn't, I always pictured cavalry as you see in movies when they're fighting the Indians and they're riding and shooting and all. Well, they didn't really do much of that in the war between the states. They more would ride to where they were going and dismount. And they usually went in groups of 5, and one guy would hold the horses and the other 4 would shoot. They took turns at this, but this was not a battle that Rufus was wounded in. It was what they call a skirmish. I heard a Civil War expert one time, he seemed to be an expert, said that the difference in a battle and a skirmish was whether you were in it or not. If you were in it, it was a battle. And it's probably a good definition, but over about Rocky Face, Georgia, or northwest Georgia, over not too far from the Alabama line, there was no battle of Rocky Face or anything like that, but a group of Confederate cavalrymen rode right head on into some Union infantrymen, and they exchanged shots. Rufus was not shot. Somebody shot his horse, and it fell on him. He was pinned under it. It broke his hips, it broke his pelvis bone. It crippled him for life. Well, in the meantime, and he had not gotten word of this at the time, his wife had gone into early labor with what would have been their 3rd child. She and the baby both died, but he didn't know this at the time, that he was wounded. Well, what few Confederates of this troop was left ran for their lives. Rufus was left there with a horse on top of him. The Union soldiers got the horse off of him and picked him up and put him in a wagon. They took him to a prison camp. He eventually was transported, I think, to Illinois, possibly to Indiana, to a more permanent camp. But at the close of the war, he was released, came back home. He was crippled. He was never able to ride a horse after that. He could not get on a horse. He rode in a buggy or buckboard or wagon, whatever they had. He was able to work, but he was crippled. His 2 daughters, they were still small at the time, lived with his old maid Aunt Maud. Rufus owned property up in Colquitt Hollow, which was north of the town a ways, but it had no house on it. He lived at Aunt Maud's house. Aunt Maud's house stood till not too many years ago. It burned, and but it was a small house, but it was 2-story, and it looked like something out of a storybook. It set back on a little rise of ground, and it dropped down, and there was a real pretty creek came down in front of it. And there was goldfish in that creek all the time because it ain't mowed, and later on other people would always go buy goldfish and put in there. So there was always a bunch of goldfish swimming in the creek. It was a very pretty place. But Rufus was not satisfied some way or another. He rambled off a lot. He would take the buggy and he would go down to Valley Head, which is off the mountain there, and the railroad came through Valley Head. They'd find the buggy at the train station. They'd ask the ticket master at the train station, well, he bought a ticket yesterday. Where to? Chattanooga. And he'd come back in a day or 2 or 3 or something. Well, it began to go longer and longer. One time he was gone for nearly 3 months. He came back and he had a little jar of sand that he said came off the beach in California. It may have come from somewhere over in Arkansas. Nobody knew, but he said he'd been to California. He'd seen the Pacific Ocean. Nobody knew. They had a little money, so he could travel some. But one day he went off like that, and he didn't return. Now his best friend was Dr. Martin Blaylock. They were cousins, and Dr. Blaylock was not. Everybody called him Dr. Blaylock, but he was not actually a doctor. He would give you something for a cold. It was mostly whiskey with a little syrup in it or something, or some honey with whiskey in it, things of this nature. But he was mainly a veterinarian. He had no license. He was not educated. He was just a skilled veterinarian, home raised, home taught. But he was good at it. But everybody respected Dr. Blaylock. He had a son, Taylor, a very young son at the time, and Dr. Blaylock was close friends with Rufus. Rufus would tell him things he didn't tell anybody else. Well, one day he's missing, and Aunt Maud contacts Dr. Blaylock. He rides down to Valley Head, and the buggy and the horse is tied there, and the ticket master says he had bought a ticket for somewhere in Texas. I don't remember which town. Well, Dr. Blaylock knows immediately he's not going to be back anytime soon, so he ties his horse behind the buggy and drives the buggy back home and puts the horse back in the pasture and puts the buggy away, and well, they don't hear from Rufus, and they don't hear from him, and they don't hear from him, and time goes on. A year passes. Then another year passes. Well, Dr. Blaylock suspects, but he don't know, and he tells Aunt Maud one day, he said, I don't know if you've thought about this or not, but Rufus always carries a little money with him, and no telling where he's gone to. Somewhere, somebody's figured out that he had a little money, and they probably killed him for the money. Aunt Maud said, I would say you're right. I'd say we'll never hear from Rufus again. Well, shortly after that, there was a letter came to Aunt Maud one day from Rufus. And he tells her to contact Dr. Blaylock and to tell him to have a buckboard and horses at the train station in Valley Head on a day, like 3 or 4 days from now. He has married and has a stepson, and they will be coming in. Well, it just overwhelms them. Well, Dr. Blaylock's there with the buckboard, and sure enough, here they come. And Rufus has accumulated a few things over the 3 years he was gone. The lady has all that she owns in the world packed up, and they unload it off the train. Dr. Blaylock loads it onto the back of the buckboard, and here they are. Very beautiful young lady. Rufus is married. She has a son. He's about 6 years old. Very handsome little man. It's quite obvious that he's Native American. As it turns out, she has gone to the Oklahoma Territory as a missionary to work with the Indian people. After being there a while, she has married the blacksmith there in the community where she lives. Shortly after their son was born, he's shoeing the horse one day and the horse kicks him in the head and he dies from it. So she's a widow lady with a little son, and Rufus has met her and married her. Brought her back to Alabama to live. So they load up. Aunt Maud stayed at home. She's got a big dinner cooked. She's invited a lot of the people because Rufus is coming back and he's got a new wife and a stepson. They're all tickled to death. Well, they get to Aunt Maud's. Dinner's on the table and everybody gangs around and eats, and they're slapping Rufus on the back and congratulating him and hugging his new wife. And she's very friendly. She sees that these people are her kind of people, and she's very much having a good time. Well, Dr. Blaylock's son, Taylor, is about 6 years old. Rufus's stepson is about 6. They spy one another pretty quick and they become friends. And this is a friendship that lasts till death did part them. They're almost the same age. They both like to get into everything that's going on. So as soon as the meal is over, they get outside to play in the creek and they take their shoes off to wade in the creek. The boy has already had to tell Taylor about 3 times what his name is. His name is Waya, W-A-Y-A. Taylor says, I've never heard of anybody named that. He said, it's a Cherokee word. He told Taylor what it meant, but you know kids, he forgot by the time he told him. They take their shoes off and their socks off to play in the creek. Taylor notices that Waya has a toe missing on his right foot. What happened to your toe? Well, I don't really remember it, but my grandfather was splitting kindling there so my mother could build a fire in the stove, and he was using a little hatchet to split his kindling with, and he carried some inside. While he was inside, I got the hatchet. I was barefooted. I dropped that hatchet on my foot and I cut a toe off. Taylor said, boy, that must have hurt. I'm sure it did, but I don't really remember it that much. And it doesn't bother me. I don't even think about it a lot of times. So they go on and play and they have a good time. Well, from that day forward, where you see one of them, you see both of them. They're the best friends it ever was. As they get a little older, their dads get horses for them. They ride horses all over that mountain, everywhere. They hunt, they fish, they do everything together. They lay out of school every chance they get. It keeps Dr. Blaylock and Rufus busy keeping the boys in school. Well, in the meantime, Rufus has built him a log house up in Colquitt Hollow. He moves his family up there. His 2 older daughters they stay on with Aunt Maud because the older one is dating, and it seems like marriage is in the future for her, and it was. She's actually my great-grandmother. But he moves his wife and son up to the hollow. Well, as time goes on, they have 3 little girls. And quite a happy family. The 2 grown daughters, Waya's kind of in between them, and 3 little girls. They really love their brother. They think he's just the greatest thing around. And Taylor's there, or he's at Taylor's, or something all the time. And they regard Taylor almost as a brother too, because they're all close. It gets on in the fall of the year in 1888. Waya and Taylor are 16 years old at the time. Rufus knows there's a wedding. The date's already set for the wedding. His oldest daughter's going to marry Tom Jones, and the date's already set. He knows he's going to need some money. He's doing all right, but he don't have any cash in his pocket. He's got several cows. There's an auction at Valley Head, so he tells Waya one day, he picks out 2 cows and he tells Waya, let's tie them to the back of the wagon and we'll go down to Valley Head and we'll sell them in that auction. I need a little pocket money. So they do that. Waya rides his horse and Rufus drives the wagon. They lead the cows down to Valley Head. They're sold in the auction. They come back home, or they start back home. Well, it's over 2 miles from where you drop off into Colquitt Hollow on to where their house is. It gets dark, and Rufus' wife realizes, he's not home yet, and she gets out and milks their milk cow and brings that milk back in, strains it, takes it on back to they have a little milk house, they call it a cooling house, where there's a spring and they've got a little house built over it. She puts the milk down into the water in jars where it will cool out. She comes on back to the house. She's got supper just about cooked. She don't want to bake the bread till they get there. And they don't come, and they don't come, and they don't come. They have an old clock up on the wall, a wind-up clock, because they don't have electricity. But she notices it's 9 o'clock. Something has happened to them. So she lights a lantern and she tells the girls, I'm going to go out and I'm going to latch the door so that it can't be opened from the outside. Don't open the door for anybody except me or your daddy or Waya. And she leaves and she heads down the road. Well, over near where you drop off into the hollow, there was a big oak tree right beside the road. Here sits the wagon. Waya's horse is standing close to the wagon. Rufus is laying back in the wagon. Waya's on the ground. They're both dead. Somebody has killed both of them. She runs on out of the holler to the nearest neighbor, and she tells them Rufus and Waya are both dead. Somebody's killed them. And the man said, well, we saw them go by here before dark, because they waved at us as they went by. Well, she goes on back home. They send for Dr. Blaylock. They send for some more people, and she goes on back to the house to tell the kids what has happened. Well, there's nothing to do, and there's no investigation or anything, nowhere to start investigating. So about 3 days after that, they bury him down at Bankhead Cemetery. The day of the funeral, after the funeral, a man that's kind of known to be a shady character by the name of Simon Pitts shows up. They're in the hollow, and he goes to the house. He tells the lady of the house, you'll have to get out. I'm taking possession of what's mine. And she said, no, this belonged to my husband. He sold it to me the day of the auction. He had a paper here where supposedly Rufus had sold Colquitt Hollow to him. And she goes down to Aunt Maud's. Aunt Maud contacts a lawyer. He checks it and he says, there's nothing we can do about it. It appears to be legal. So she loads up her daughters and their belongings and goes back down to Aunt Maud's and live. Simon Pitts moves into the house there. He begins to post signs all around Colquitt Hollow. Trespassers will be shot on sight. Do not enter. Very wicked man. Well, let's fast forward from then. That was in October. Let's move on to about February. Dr. Blaylock and Taylor were hunting, and they had ridden all the way around Colquitt Hollow. They were on the far side of it. Just about daylight, Taylor kills a deer. Pretty good little deer. They field dress it. Well, while they're field dressing it, it begins to snow, a wet snow. It's falling heavy and thick. Dr. Blaylock tells Taylor, we're going to have to take a chance on crossing this hollow. We may get shot at, but we're going to have to take a chance because if we go around the way we came, we'll be stranded. So they set out on their horses back across. Well, they haven't gone too far across the hollow till all at once they hear gunfire. I mean, it's rapid fire. As they used to say in the old movies, somebody was fanning the hammer. Bam, 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 bam. And Taylor said, is it a war, Dad? He said, I don't know, but somebody's doing a lot of shooting. Well, he says, well, let's see what it is. So they start riding toward where they had heard the shots. As they go, they meet a horse, and it's running. It's wild-eyed, and it's running, and it's scared to death. You can tell. And they try to catch it, but it runs by them, and it's gone. And Dr. Blaylock says, that's Simon Pitts' horse. And Taylor said, well, maybe somebody shot him. Dr. Blaylock said, don't say that, son. That's not right. He's on his own property, and if maybe nothing's happened. Maybe he was just target practicing and the horse ran off. They ride on a little further. They go over just a little rise of ground, and there on the ground is the mortal remains of Simon Pitts. Something has killed him. Not just killed him, but badly mauled him. He's bit and torn, and his clothes is torn nearly off of him. And he had died a horrible death. They get off and they're looking around, and there's some tracks on the ground. Taylor tells Dr. Blaylock, said, that's the biggest dog tracks I've ever seen. Dr. Blaylock said, son, those aren't dog tracks. You don't remember this, but when I was a child, there was wolves on this mountain. And that's a wolf track. I haven't seen one in years, but that is a wolf track. Well, they begin to look. The tracks go into a brush pile over here, and they don't come back out. Taylor notices something. On one of the hind paws, there's a toe missing. About the time he notices that, it comes to him what Waya told him the day they met down there by the creek. In the Cherokee language, Waya means wolf.